Welcome to The MASH, a special presentation for the St. Louis Bourbon Society. Today, we are talking with special guest, Conor Kelly. All right, so Conor, hey, thanks a lot for joining me today. I appreciate you joining me. Again, this is going to be for the St. Louis Bourbon Society, specifically for the St. Louis Bourbon Society. And I know you, I've known you for quite a while, but nobody else that I know of knows you from the St. Louis Bourbon Society. So could you do me a favor and introduce yourself for the 10,000 plus members of the St. Louis Bourbon Society?
Yeah, my name is Conor Kelly. I'm a distillery here in northern Utah. My background is I used to make wine in Central California, which is where I'm from Fresno, California. And I made wine there for, I think, a total of like 3 years, from really small wineries up to making Franzia bag in the box. Sunset Blush was my specialty. And then I made brandy as I was leaving Fresno State University, where I got my degree in enology, which is the science of winemaking. I made brandy for Christian Brothers Brandy out of Parlier, California. And while I was there, did a bunch of different brandies. We also messed with some gins. And then I applied to work for a distillery here in Utah. And I've been making whiskey here for almost a year and a half now. Some days it feels like 5 years, some days it feels like 6 months, but I absolutely love it. And I don't think I'll go back to fruit anytime soon, but we'll see.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to say first of all, cheers.
Hey,
Cheers to
launch it.
you. What are you drinking tonight?
Tonight I am drinking High West High Country Single Malt. It is distilled 100% at High West up there in One Ship, as well as a little bit in Park City. And I think I have a sample here of Boo Ride that got released this year to sip on afterwards. What are
Very
you
cool.
drinking?
So I'm also just by chance. I knew you worked for a Utah distillery. I don't know exactly which one, but I decided to grab something from a Utah distillery. So I'm drinking last year's Midwinter's Night's Dram. So this
Oh, very
is
cool.
Act 8, Scene 3.
Yeah,
Uh,
the bourbon drinker's rye whiskey, as it were.
Absolutely. And I mean, like we know each other well enough to where you know that I'm a huge fan of rye whiskey anyway. I don't like to pigeon myself just into bourbon. Um, I consider myself very much a whiskey drinker, not a bourbon drinker, as do most of the folks within St. Louis Bourbon Society.
Sure. I
So,
mean, yeah, I mean, all American whiskey gets the love in my mind, but yeah,
yeah, I don't even narrow it down to just American. Everybody except for Canadians. No, there are some fantastic Canadian whiskeys out there, that's for sure.
absolutely.
But Connor, I had a question for you. I know that the distillery you work for is not a small distillery. It's a fairly large. I'd call it mid-size. Is that appropriate?
Yeah, I'd say it's big for a craft distillery.
Nice. Yeah,
Yeah.
great wording. So, can you tell us about the average workday, just the normal everyday workday, at your distillery?
Well, on the drive in, you got to be on your toes and miss the deer and the snowshoe hare and the elk. But one of the interesting parts about work is mashing and getting your beer in the still have to be priority number one. And you're like, well, it's two tasks, but you got to multitask a little bit. A lot of brew houses and distilleries based off brew houses seem to lean into multitasking on one person's shoulders. And so when I get in, first thing I'm doing is I'm checking my fermenter that is scheduled to go into the still that morning. I check the final gravity, make sure it's dry or very close to within dry. Because in wine, we look for a negative Brix value because alcohol is less dense than water. So obviously you can technically get a negative Brix. But with whiskey, with all the solids in it, you usually are very close to zero, and you say, okay, that's good to go in the still. And then I'll start sending my hot water to the mash tank because that takes a while to send in there. And then as the day progresses, I'm sending the grains into the mash tank. I'm heating up, coming over into heads, about to come over into spirit, and it's a whirlwind of a morning. It definitely, it can be cold here in Utah, 10 degrees, but once you're inside and you're running around like a madman and the still starts to heat up, it's a great furnace. You stay pretty warm and stay pretty busy. And next thing you know, it's, around noon and you're getting ready to go home. So a lot of
Okay.
cleaning though, definitely a lot of cleaning in our daily tasks. If anyone was ever interested in getting into distilling for a career, there is a lot less pontificating what's in your glass and a lot more screaming at a hose because there's a kink caught on a bolt on the floor.
Whenever you and I first talked about us meeting up, I asked you which specific topic you wanted to go really deep into. And I was really, really glad with the topic that you picked, because I think it's one of the least known aspects of the entire distillation process. And I joke around and I say, if you mess up the mash, then maybe your whiskey's going to taste like crap. If you mess up the fermentation process, maybe it's going to taste like crap. If you mess up something, generally speaking, it's still going to be fine to drink. It just might not be the way you enjoy your whiskey. However, the topic that you picked, if somebody messes that up, somebody could
Uh,
potentially have a way worse hangover.
there you go. I'll drink to that.
And so, how do you know when to cut from heads to hearts and from hearts to tails? How do you know?
So I was just born in this way. No, um, a bit of trial and error and using the tools and the context clues that the still will give you. So my first distillation I ever did when I was working for Christian Brothers was an apple brandy trial that we were kind of messing around with, and I completely missed the heads cut. I saw spirit coming over and I like smelled it and I'm like, this is lovely, and just threw it all in the receiver. And my mentor, bless his heart, was like, I think it could use a redistillation. And so that's the nice part about if you miss cuts is you technically can redistill it later. But as far as deciding when to make cuts, I know some folks who go off taste, and they were trained kind of essentially by moonshiners, where they kind of they'll recognize the taste of methanol on their tongue, which I don't do that whatsoever. I don't want to mess with that. But for me, you can use temperature as a guideline, you can use proof as a guideline, but at the end of the day, your nose has to have the final say, in my opinion. So like where we're located, we're just over 6,000 feet above sea level. Our boiling points are drastically different. Normally, ethanol boils at 173. Us, it'll be closer to 163. So if I see that the temp is at 160 degrees or 161 degrees Fahrenheit, I'm like, I'm not going to cut, but I'm getting close. Or if my proof, say I have a parameter where I want to cut at 164 proof, let's say that. Now, if my proof is 168, that's still definitely heads. I want to let that develop and kind of get away from my spirit. When you run the still slowly, those cuts become real clear and concise because you're giving the still time to separate it out. You are slowing down the boiling, which will allow stuff to come off one at a time, which is actually how they analyze spirits with a gas chromatograph. But that's a whole nother topic I'm not too qualified to talk on. But that's actually how column distillation works, where different areas in the column, the heads will be closer to the top, then the spirit will be in the middle, and then the tails will be towards the bottom. So I'll use temperature and I'll use proof, but at the end of the day, I'll use my nose. And the nice part about the distillery I work for is we distill multiple different types of whiskey. So we produce a few different bourbon recipes, we produce a few different rye recipes, 2 to 3 different malt recipes, and it is different. It's kind of like accents, the differences between that transition in bourbon or rye or malt. um I'll speak more towards the bourbon since that's clearly the audience. If it's a high rye bourbon, I've noticed that that line is usually pretty clear to me, where heads is kind of repugnant and it's got almost like a burnt matchstick. I compare it to like lemon pledge, where if you smelled your mom cleaning with it on a Saturday morning, you were like, this is not going to go well. It's kind of just, it's a really unpleasant, harsh, metallic character. And first timers can sometimes describe it as buttery and nice, because I know I did. But then once you get used to distilling for a living, you learn to hate that smell. Same with tails. There's certain parts where it's almost nauseating. So when I'm coming over into heads, there will be that really harsh where it kind of blows your head back. You're like, this is definitely not going in my spirit. But then what I've learned through error is there's a gray area. There's a gray area of a transition, because I use a pot still at work. Technically, it's a hybrid still because it has a column attached to it, but it works like a pot still. And there's this gray area where I believe that if we ran it slower, that gray area would be smaller or non-existent. But because of the speed at which we run, there is a gray area where you could cut, but you shouldn't. Because part of the problem is you'll notice those heads later when you mingle your entire batch, and it'll either come off as like solventy or just kind of a negative attribute, that can sometimes mask some of the nice aromas. But then the other side of that is if you cut too late, you're going to lose a lot of those delicate fruity esters that you want later, especially coming off of rye. Rye distills a lot like a brandy in a sense. It's very, very fruity for a grain. Um, so that gray area is kind of the do or die going off your gut, essentially, where you want to, if you're being safe, you go towards the end of it when it just smells nice and pretty, but you can kind of be a little bold and go a little bit into the gray area. And then as far as spirit to tails, the way I like to run the still, and I'm not gatekeeping, I'm still very new as a distiller, but I like to share what I do know because that's the only way I've learned from other distillers. I like to run my still. I like to heat it up relatively slowly. Now, this is all dependent on whether you're going just for flavor or you've got PGs to hit or you've got some boss screaming down your neck that he needs the distillation done yesterday. I like to run the heads fairly slowly to help separate the acetaldehyde, the acetone, the methanol, the ethyl acetate, all that away from the spirit so that my cut is very clear and concise and there's no muddling of flavors there. And then when I'm in spirit, I can run it however I want. Bourbon, I would like to run it fast because I think the end product is better that way. It brings a lot of kind of the fatty oils out of the tails that are nice. And then rye, I like to run it a little slower because I don't want to beat up on the spirit. And then barley, it's hit or miss. Barley is kind of a weird one for me. And then when it comes to tails, when I'm getting towards the end of tails, I'm tracking my distillation with proof primarily, but also temperature, proof and temp. And when I notice my proof is starting to get to an area where I'm supposed to cut, I'm going to slow the still down. And when I say speeding up or slowing down the still, you can do this with messing with your glycol or whatever your condensing liquid is, whether it be chilled water or glycol, or you can mess with your heat. And for me, in my distillation, I keep adding heat because as you pull ethanol out of the solution, out of the beer that's in the pot, you have essentially more and more water, which is going to need more and more heat to boil it. So I'm adding heat during the distillation incrementally, but as I notice I'm getting close to the tails, I'm going to stop adding heat and I'm just going to let it ride. I'm going to let it coast, kind of like when you see a light turn yellow that you're definitely not going to make. You stop accelerating. You're like, I'm going to have to brake anyway. Why am I going to accelerate towards this? But I'm doing that also so that I don't get tails being shoved up into the spirit. It's a metaphor, but I want that clear line just like I wanted between heads and spirit. I want that same clear line between spirit and tails. Because tails, this is my disagreement with Canadian distillers. But with light whiskey, they don't want tails in their product. But tails are what develop in the barrel. That's one of bourbon's defining characteristics to me. That's the funny part about bourbon is it doesn't always taste that nice fresh off the still. Like it tastes great coming fresh off the still out of the parrot. But when you have a batch that you just distilled and you mix it up, it doesn't taste all that pleasant at times. It can be lovely, especially wheated bourbon, but like a high rye bourbon can be a little funky, a little weird, kind of like a Jamaican rum almost. And it's because of those tails. But then you let it sit in barrel for 5-6 years, and you're like, holy crap, this is fantastic. So you want some tails, but you also don't want to be bringing up those like wet dog, wet cardboard, grass, and hay. You don't want that in
The
your wood.
funk, the
Exactly.
must. Yeah.
And, some people talk about like Texas having a funk, but I don't know if that's in regards to tails or if it's the heat. All over the U.S. it's a drastically different distillation scenario, but that's why I like to slow it down a little bit. And then once I get into tails, once I get into tails, I know it's a little seizure there apparently. Once I divert my spirit away from my spirit receiver, once I divert the parrot over to the heads and tails tanks, uh, run as fast as safely possible. Because we recycle our heads and tails because we have a pot still that we can run a distillation in one run because we have our hybrid column. But we have to keep our heads and tails for it. So once I am in tails, as long as it's at a safe temperature that I'm not worried about, potential vapors and eventually a fire hazard, I'll run it pretty fast, which I'll kick up my condensing liquid first. Because, you don't want to accelerate super hard if you got, some AC Delco brakes or something from O'Reilly that are on their last leg. So just to be safe, I like to run it that way.
Okay. Well, Connor, I really appreciate you going that in depth about cutting because again, I think that broadly speaking, not just with about myself, but really the bourbon public as a whole, that's something that gets glossed over a lot. Like you hear people talking about the mash bill. Oh, what's the mash bill of this, that, or the other? There's been a huge influx of the number of people that want to know more information about yeast because part of this bourbon boom, people are realizing how important yeast is to the final product.
Yeah.
We hear all about different char levels of barrels and of course the age statement and what level of the rick house.
Oh yeah, which floor and
Yeah.
yeah.
But there's this super important thing that happens that, like I said, too much and most likely it's just going to give you a wicked bad hangover, but it also plays such a huge part into what that final product tastes like. And yeah, so thanks for sharing the details of that. Is there anything else you wanted to mention as far as like cutting?
Cutting is one of those things where there are some craft distilleries who I've talked to, and they said that they have a still setup that does the cuts for them, and it's like that scene in I think it was Anchorman 2 where Ron Burgundy's like, "Who's driving?" He's like, "We don't need to drive. We have cruise control." And it's like, I wouldn't, but
Okay, so I had a couple other quick questions for you.
go for it.
Here's a huge one that I want to know. What is one thing that you wish more, let's call them whiskey enthusiasts, knew about the distillation process?
Okay, I got two things. One, stop freaking out about methanol. These are prohibition era myths perpetrated by teetotalers and Puritans, and so don't support those myths. Methanol is not that big of a deal. Don't drink it, from Lowe's or Home Depot. And the other thing I was gonna say is, and this is to, I wouldn't call it. I think the affectionate phrase for them is taters, or shoot, I would call them gatekeepers. But the people who give the newcomers grief for adding water or ice or even Coke. Like honestly, I wanted to take my Leopold Bros 3-chamber up there and put some vanilla Coke Zero in it just to annoy some people on the internet. But I couldn't even bring myself to do that. But I was specifically talking about water. It makes me laugh when people are like, "How dare you?" There was one person in particular that was like, "I will not disrespect the distillers by adding water to my whiskey," and I'm like, we add so much water. Like literally, like we have to have water to hydrate the corn, to ferment the corn, and then on top of that, unless you're drinking 140 150 proof whiskey, water was added to it. You're not going to put 150 proof spirit in a barrel because it's going to suck, because you want water to pull the hydrolyzable tannins and sugars, not just the ethanol soluble ones. I know Jack Daniels has that single barrel, whatever, that's like 143 proof. Save your taste buds. Stop drinking that. No, but put it on the ice. Add some water. It's okay. But like when people are like, I don't dare disrespect the distiller. It's like, one, like, oh, sorry, I'm getting heated, but I think it's virtue signaling. I think it's silly. And I'm not saying this to pick on anyone or be a jerk or hurt anyone's feelings, but I'm more just saying it's okay to add water. It's okay to have ice.
If they want to.
If they want to, exactly.
Yeah.
The Whiskey Tribe on YouTube, and they're also on Facebook, have it best. The best whiskey in the world is the one you like to drink the way you like to drink it.
Yep. Last question I got for you. What's one thing that you wish more people knew about the nondescript distillery that you work for? Or
Art.
and you can take that however you want.
Yeah. Our distillery was, its claim to fame and its origin story was based in blending. And there are some craft distillers, actually, I'll rephrase that. There are some craft distilleries in America that give us grief for it, which I don't think is fair, because they say, well, they just sourced it. It is what it is. Like, it's cheating. It's not cheating unless you're dishonest about it. But if you're honest about it, anyone who's tried to put together a blend knows how goddamn hard it is, and how, like, when people go distilling in art, I kind of get annoyed with that, because I think it's a craft. I think I'm a craftsman. I practice my craft. Blending is genuinely bordering on art, and I'm really, grasping at straws for gripes, because a lot of people, still love us and admire us for what we blend and for what we distill. Yeah, actually, I will give a quick shout out, because this is the Bourbon Society.
Yeah.
I'm not picking out anything that these folks haven't heard of, if they haven't tried or have bottles of. But one distillery that I think deserves a lot more attention and acknowledgement, or at least respect, is Iron Root Republic down there in Denison, Texas. Because they're messing around, and I guess Jephthah Creed in Kentucky. There's a lot of folks who are starting to realize heirloom corns, in my opinion, are the way to really expanding the bourbon universe. Because whether it's Bloody Butcher or using blue corn, I think that's like the new frontier for bourbon, because bourbon kind of, pigeonholed itself in a sense, 51% corn, brand new charred barrels, which Michter's American, I love them for essentially making a bourbon and not putting it into brand new charred barrels.
Okay.
I think it's a cool, kind of little bit of that to the bourbon industry, which sometimes is needed. Patriots are usually good critics. So Iron Root Republic, Harbinger, that was a really eye-opening bourbon that I've had recently, for sure. I guess the one disclaimer I'll chuck in there is my opinions are my own and do not reflect my employer that I may or may not be employed by.
There you go.
But I'll say I wish I made mellow corn. I'll just
I wish you
about
did too.
whiskeys you're a fan of, mellow corn and Maker's Mark.
I am well known for my love of mellow corn. Well, Connor, I want to thank you for joining me. Appreciate the time, and keep up the good work, dude. The distillery that you work for, I'm a huge fan of. Let's put it that way.
Hey, and anyone who may or may not find me the needle in the haystack of Utah alcohol producers, if you see me on one of our tours, feel free to take me aside and let me know that you're a part of the St. Louis Bourbon Society, because part of the problem with our tours is you can't get into the weeds like we are right now, which is what we want to do as distillers. And I feel like the consumers want, because first and foremost, I'm a whiskey consumer, and you can't give people these super dry info bits about a cleaning system, or we use this yeast versus this one and alpha amylase. That's where they're like, dude, I just want a whiskey sour and get out of here. So so I love that people are interested. To all the bourbon lovers, corn sucks to work with. But corn, absolutely, I wish the pioneers made whiskey with anything else